Now, anytime you've got to cut 2 or more pieces of wood to exactly the same length, this is the way you don't want to do it. You don't want to take a tape measure and measure and mark each one, because every time you do this, you can introduce a small error, and in some projects that can be critical. But here are 4, count them, 4 ways to cut multiple boards to precisely the same length.
Method 1. Measure and mark one board, then cut it to length. Write pattern or sample on the cut piece. Now, instead of measuring and marking additional pieces, use the pattern. Make sure the ends are flush and use a sharp pencil for the marking.
Now remember, it's important to use the same pattern every time. If you start changing patterns, you can start changing the length of the wood you're cutting. Now the second way to cut multiple pieces to exactly the same length is to lay them down on a bench top, square up the ends, clamp them together, measure and mark one time, and then cut all 4 pieces at once. Now, if you've got a whole lot of pieces to cut or clamping things together is impractical, here's a third technique using the power miter saw.
Clamp a strip of wood to the miter saw fence. I'll call this the auxiliary fence. A 1x4 or a 1x3 is a good size. With the board clamped, cut off the end. Now put the measuring tape on the cut end and measure and mark the length of the boards you want to cut. Place a scrap piece of wood on the mark and clamp it in position. I call this a stop block. Place an oversized piece of stock on the saw table and slide it until the end contacts the stop block. Hold it firmly and make the cut. Any number of pieces can be cut this way with identical results.
And finally, here's how to use that same stop block technique on a table saw.
In this case, I'll screw the auxiliary fence to the table saw miter gauge. Once it's attached, I cut partially through the auxiliary fence. Then drop the end of the tape into the saw kerf, measure down the fence, mark the finished length of the boards I'm cutting, and clamp on the stop block. Here, I set the workpiece on the table saw, slide it down until it contacts the stop block, hold it securely against the auxiliary fence, and make the cut.
Well, you can't get much better than that. 4 ways to make repetitive cuts that are virtually identical.